Good afternoon, Facebook. Taylor Hemness from 41 Action News coming to you with another episode of Faith in KC. I realized as soon as I started recording this that I'm wearing sunglasses for the second time in a row. I hope you don't mind. I'm very squinty and I'm facing the sun, so I didn't want to squint at you the entire time I'm talking, just like last time when I was outside my church. So please forgive the sunglasses. I'm stopped today at a park near my home, and I wanted to talk to you about where my two lives meet. I get up at 3:30, or I get up before 3:30 to be ready for a 3:30 a.m. conference call on weekdays. That's where my day starts. And then I work until about noon. And so it's about 12:30, 12:45 as I record this. And then I go home. Right now I have a house full of 8 beings in it whenever I get home. A dog and a cat, my gorgeous wife Katie, and 5 kids. 3 of them ours. But the other 2 are there because they're doing virtual learning together. We have our neighbors there. They've been in our bubble for months now. And so we have 3 first graders, 2 of mine and 1 of theirs, and 2 third graders, 1 of mine, 1 of theirs. And they're all doing virtual learning together right now because their parents work full-time jobs. My wife is a stay-at-home mom and is able to be home with them, and that's been a real blessing, I think, to both of our families. And my wife is a superhero for doing what she's doing to help those kids right now. And she's a former teacher too, so that I know there's part of her that's enjoying it. But it's a very different life, and I'm not going to suggest that I have to downshift or upshift or whatever you want to call it. It's just different, and I know I'm not alone in that. I know a lot of you watching have that kind of duality. I'm putting my hand kind of right in the middle of the frame there, where whether it's work life and home life, family life versus not family life, in-laws, we all have kind of that breakup a little bit. And why that struck me today is because the person I'm interviewing in this episode of Faith in KC comes from a background of faith, obviously, and science. And I was so excited to talk to her, and her conversation and what she had to say is really, really great, and I hope you'll enjoy it. But I just wanted you to get in the mindset as you listen to this episode of where your 2 differences meet, whatever they are. And not that faith and science have to be different, but she comes from 2 pretty specific backgrounds, and she uses them really, really well right now. And it inspired me to make sure that I'm making the most out of all the sides of me too. So hope you enjoy. As always, reach out. You can look for me on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, or email me at taylor.hemness@kshb.com. Share this video, leave your comments. Let us know what you think. Thanks again for watching Faith in KC. Hello, welcome to another edition of Faith in KC. I'm Taylor Hemness from 41 Action News, the morning anchor here at Channel 41, sitting in a different studio than I normally get to sit in, but looking for a quiet spot to conduct this interview today. Very, very glad to be joined today by Dr. Nancy Howell, who's from St. Paul's School of Theology and here in the Kansas City area. Dr. Howell, thank you so much for taking some time out and for having this conversation with me today.
I'm happy to be here.
So at this point, I'm not sure what number episode this is going to be. So if this is your first one watching this on Facebook, welcome. We hope you enjoy this conversation and get something out of it. If this is your first one, this is a new series we're doing called Faith in KC, because we wanted to talk about what faith and religion and spirituality has been like and how it's been impacted, especially during this wild year that we're all living through, for people of faith and people who are not from the faith community, honestly. I encourage you to go back and look at previous episodes of this. I've talked to several people already from lots of different backgrounds, and I welcome your comments during this. Please feel free to reach out to me on social media as well. I'm on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, and you can comment here as you watch the video if you feel the need. But please, as always, keep those as civil as possible. We're talking about some heavy topics, so we know we might get some strong opinions, but we welcome those. Dr. Howell, as we get into this conversation today, I was so excited to talk to you, and Dr. Howell and I have never met, but the reason I was so excited to talk to you is because obviously you teach there at St. Paul's and come from a faith background, but also come from a background of science. So as we get into this conversation today, if you would just tell us a little bit about what your background is in science.
I was an undergraduate major in biology with every intention of becoming a medical missionary. when I was 18 years old and started school. And I thought science would be a way that a woman could live out her faith in the community. When I graduated from college, I went to the University of Chicago to think my life over the way 21-year-olds do. I wanted to decide whether to go to grad school and become a researcher or whether to go to med school as I had planned, and got to work in amazing laboratories working on pharmacology and the mapping of the neonatal rat brain, and then in a lab on viral oncology. We were studying cancer and the role of viruses and genetics in that research.
Sorry, I'm having to go off and on mute here. I apologize for that. As for your faith background, tell me about your role and what you teach at St. Paul's.
I'm a theologian. My background is in philosophy of religion and theology, and I'm also the Popley Professor of Health and Welfare Ministries. I'm committed in my teaching to working on two things, interdisciplinary ways of thinking. So I often bring science and religion together in my classrooms, but I'm interested also in issues of justice, which is common to faculty at St. Paul School of Theology. I want to know how issues of science and religion differently affect people who, by gender, by sexual orientation, by race or ethnicity, even by religion.
So I have to start with this question. I can't imagine what this year has been like for you, just as an observer, with the background that you have, both in a faith background that you just described, your scientific background, just to watch this play out with COVID-19 this year. What has it been like you, just from an observation standpoint? What have you noticed? What are the things that you've seen that have stuck out to you in the last 6 months?
I began my work, as I told you, working in a lab that worked with viruses and on cancer research. And when I first began to see the news reports on the COVID virus, I immediately had my mind run back to that time in my life. I know how viruses work. I know how aggressive they can be. And there were points at which I remember thinking, people are doing things that are pretty dangerous, pretty risky. People are not realizing that this virus has a self-interest, and it is to thrive. It is to propagate. It's to move from person to person. And I was certainly hoping we would be a lot more careful as a population than we are. I was concerned, for example, when I would see groups just gathering as families, because they wouldn't always remember that just because we're related doesn't mean I can't, catch something from my child or my grandparent. So I was a little bit concerned about our behaviors.
It's been a wild year, obviously, for anyone in the science and the faith community. First off, before I get too far into that, were you still in the middle of courses in March when that happened? Did you have to finish out some courses at home?
We did. Fortunately, St. Paul has been teaching online using course management software and Zoom for some time. So for me, it was an easy transition to move from a face-to-face classroom to a synchronous meeting with Zoom and all my students.
I was fortunate enough to study abroad when I was in college and had the chance to take a course on. I was a political science minor. Sorry, the phone here is getting a little loud. But I had the chance to take Western European politics while I was in Western Europe, and to be able to kind of experience that from a student standpoint and from a visitor to Western Europe standpoint. What kind of courses were you teaching, and how did all of a sudden you get to talk about COVID-19 in a whole different way as an educator back in March and April when this hit?
I was teaching a couple of courses, so we had a chance to look at the COVID from two different angles. One course was on a philosophical theology that very much is interested in ecology in connection with science. And so we were able to talk about the intersections of human behavior and what happens in the natural world. and talk about God's place in that. In the other course, I was teaching about race and Christianity, and we were able to talk about the different challenges and effects of the viruses on communities that are already vulnerable and at risk.
That's, I mean, I can't think of a pair of courses more appropriately marrying what we're living through right now in 2020. How are your students? I mean, I don't want you to get into specifics about people necessarily, but what were your students thinking and asking and talking about whenever this was all going on, whenever you still had them during that spring semester?
It seems like 100 years ago, doesn't it?
Right. Yeah.
We've been through a lot since then. The students I had were fairly astute. We'd had, it's a lot easier to have a conversation when you have months to have it rather than 15 minutes or an hour, right? So we were already well prepped for the conversations. I found my students really able to empathize with persons and communities out of those courses. I found them able to think very clearly about faith stances in relationship to what was going on in the world at the time. Our students, because they're training for ministries, are especially empathetic and always leaping into pastoral care kinds of issues. How can I care for a congregation? And when March hit, two colleagues and I, Dr. Casey Sigmund and Samantha Potter, our IT specialists, actually began to do work on what it means to be a church when one is in a totally new situation. So we were even doing some teaching on the side about how to have preaching and worship online and what the best practices are.
So let's get into a little bit meatier conversation here, because I'm really curious, and again I'm almost jealous of your background right now, of being able to observe what this year has been like with your background, because obviously as a journalist it's got some odd things and some things you notice that are unique to my profession, but I can't imagine having the expertise and the background you have and living through this year. It must be fascinating. I really want to ask you about the church's response, and almost individual churches' responses to the way COVID has been. You know, we've even had a lawsuit filed here locally in Kansas City about being able to go and worship. We heard a lot about, listen, if Group A can gather, why can't I have X amount of people in my church to gather together and worship on a Sunday morning? And I say Sunday morning, obviously it's not just the Christian faith that was affected by this. Any congregation, no matter the faith, many of them were not able to gather. The church that I attend, I still can't go to. We haven't had in-person church since March. What was your response as you watched how churches individually and how congregations responded to being told, nope, you can't gather in person right now?
In part, we have to be a little bit forgiving, because normally this is not a topic that we cover in seminary as we're training clergy. So everybody was scrambling at first. I watched some very skillful attention to the virus and how to conduct worship at the start. For example, Church of the Resurrection in Leawood was highly communicative with the congregation about what the plan was. The church did conduct worship not only online, but also on television, so people could watch either way and participate. And regular weekly communications have let people in the church know what's happening and how decisions are being made. I attend a smaller church in Kansas City, Trinity United Methodist Church on Armour Boulevard. Fortunately, that church had also been doing live streaming of worship, so we continued to do that with, at first, very limited numbers of people in the sanctuary itself. So people who preached and the liturgist and the musicians were there, no choir, just our choir leader. And I watched that church have to go in and out of various phases of attention to the virus. At first, no one was in the sanctuary except maybe 5 people. Then eventually we had practices of wearing masks and sitting far apart in the congregation. Many of us who have health conditions that would make attending riskier chose to stay home and watch worship from our own isolated spaces. When our pastor and his spouse got the coronavirus, we again shut down the space for a time, realizing that there was another surge in the virus, and are still, I think, in the phase of having very few people in the space itself. Even at the seminary, we have chapel as part of our student experience. We have been worshiping on Zoom since March. And you know what? There are exciting things that happen. For example, Trinity United Methodist Church saw not just the surge in the virus around it, but we saw a surge in attendance of worship because of the changes. I saw a surge in attendance of chapel at the seminary because now people who are members of the board of trustees, people from 2 different campuses, one in Oklahoma City and the one in Leawood campus, can now worship together. So there have been some exciting and good things that have happened because of the virus.
Let's pull actual church buildings out of the conversation and talk about just people of faith right now. Christian, Muslim, Jewish, people of faith, people who profess a certain faith. What the personal response has been to so many stimuli this year, whether it be being told, no, you can't, ... being told you have to wear a mask, whether it be the racial upheaval and tension we've seen. Obviously, I want to check with you on that too, because of the courses you just described that you were teaching there and your background. The response of people of faith to 2020. From where I sit, I've seen good things and seen some not so good things. How would you characterize the response of the faith community to this crazy year we're living?
From the comfort of my own home, I, of course, haven't been able to visit every situation.
Right.
So I don't have a good sociological answer to that question. I can make a few observations, though. One is this. Whether you're a person of faith or whether you're not, you're equally vulnerable to this virus. And that's an important thing. I don't think we should get into the idea that and I don't mean to criticize a particular congregation, but I don't want us to think that just because that going into a church building is a sign of faithfulness.
Right.
Because our faith contends that God is omnipresent. That means God is everywhere. And we will worship by whatever means necessary, even Zoom or live streaming or Facebook or by television. We're going to worship and God will be present. There's absolutely no question about that. So there are not litmus tests to see whether one is faithful during the COVID virus or not. It is people who of faith get the virus, people of no faith get the virus. And as Job says, rain falls on both the just and the unjust. So the first thing I think we have to deal with is that the virus is a human thing. Christians and non-Christians and Buddhists and Jews and Muslims are all human beings vulnerable to this same crisis. So that's one piece of the story I'd like to share.
I want to make sure it's clear. I've talked about this in previous episodes of this, and I want to remind people again. The point of these conversations is not to criticize anyone, as she just said there, because I don't think anyone could prepare themselves for what this year has been. We are all responding, I think, as best we can in many cases. So this is not to criticize anyone's actions or anything like that. I want to make that clear. I want to ask you about the love your neighbor aspect of many faiths, mine, yours, and many others. When it comes to, first, let's talk about coronavirus, and then we'll talk about the racial aspect too, but I want to ask you about coronavirus first, because so much of what we're told, we interview doctors every morning. I listen to doctor calls every morning, and we have doctors on twice a week on 41 Action News Today about the masks being about protecting other people, that are not necessarily, your mask is not going to keep you, potentially that kind of thing. It's so if you cough, you're not giving what you have potentially to someone else. There's been some pushback to that, including from the faith community. How do you see that aspect of many faiths, that caring for your neighbor, caring for other people, mixing or maybe not mixing so well with some of the requirements and mandates we've been given as part of this pandemic?
We live in a pretty individualistic sort of nation right now. Self-interest does predominate, and we want our freedoms and our rights. But Christianity and other religions too are communal ways of being in the world. Some would say that Christianity is in fact countercultural, because we are a communal faith. We are a connected way of being in this world. Our scriptures tell us, especially Matthew 25, that we are to care for others, those who are sick, those who are in prison, those who are hungry. Our faith is supposed to be about caring for others. It seems to me a very small inconvenience to wear a mask if it can help prevent my neighbor from becoming ill. And my neighbors are of all ages.
Right.
You know, maybe as on my block, maybe as old as 90 and as young as toddler. And all the people who walk on my sidewalk include those who are senior like me, and babies in carriages, and strollers. And it seems a very small thing for me to keep my distance, and to actually, we're not doing that much more than we do during a regular flu season, when we're supposed to stay away from people. When we are sick, we're supposed to wash our hands. We're supposed to sneeze into our elbows or cough into our elbows. All we're adding is wearing a mask, and probably standing at a greater distance than we are comfortable with sometimes. It's easy, I know, for us to forget. But if this really were a violent situation, we would act immediately on our instincts about protecting our neighbors. Wearing a mask should be our current instinct about caring for our neighbors, and even strangers.
It seems to me, I think most people, whether they're from a background of faith or not, have heard the old, there was a flood, the guy died, and said, God, why didn't you save me? I sent a boat, I sent a helicopter, I think most people have heard that joke. There feels like a little bit of that in real life right now when it comes to the combination of science and faith on this kind of thing. And what I mean is, we have experts in the medical field who are encouraging us to take certain actions. There's been pushback, and not just from the faith community, but this is what this series of conversations is about the faith community. That pushback between science and faith right now, do you see it as being exacerbated by something like this, or was it already kind of simmering a little bit to a certain extent?
It's been simmering, and I don't know that it's necessarily worse now. It may be that we're talking about it more now. I think drive around. Yeah. Look at hospitals, for example. What are their names? Saint somebody. Yeah. Saint Luke, Saint whatever.
Blank. Yeah, there's lots.
Yeah, fill in the blank there. Look around. What are the hospitals called? Baptist?
Sure.
There is a reason for that. Science and faith have been connected, especially medical science and faith. That's because Christianity is inclusive of an understanding that health and wholeness are important. We're concerned about spirit, but also body, and we recognize that body and spirit are connected. in important ways, in God created and blessed ways. So we ought not be alarmed at all about the connection between science and faith. We follow a Savior, Jesus Christ, who is considered our model, our role model for being concerned about the health and wholeness of people, the spiritual health, the psychological health, the bodily health. This is, we worship this God who is about resurrection and healing of people. So I don't see the long-term conflict here that people have been talking about. And scholarship can't document a long-term conflict. But we do have more, I'd say, regional, even familial ways of being concerned about the relationship of science and religion. We see it primarily in the debate about evolution. You know, that's been the predominant one. It feels less dangerous. We debate about it when it comes to school textbooks and content of science courses. But even on that controversial topic, science has not been isolated from religion. Some of our important academic institutions like Duke University, for example, have programs and a center on spirituality and health. We hear the story about Galileo and his relationship to the Catholic Church when he began to question the way that the earlier church saw how the earth was positioned in relationship to the sun and other planets. And what's interesting there is Galileo was not put to death, as I've heard some scientists say, but in fact was more like under house arrest and wasn't prevented from doing his research. And in fact, when you think about it, some of the continuing research is conducted by the Vatican Observatory. So some of the conflict between science and religion is fairly contemporary, but it should be taken seriously because there are people who feel like they are betraying their families and are betraying their communities if they advocate for science or if they show any inclination to agree with science on particular issues. On some things, I think we have little tension. On other topics, we have great tension.
Absolutely. I went to a Christian university. I'm a graduate of Abilene Christian University in West Texas. And there's to say something like a Texan, there's a big old science building on the campus of Abilene Christian University. And I was always, as a journalism guy, I did not make it into that building very often, but any chance I had to interact with another student who was a biology major or pre-med or anything like that, I always like to pick their brain a little bit about what that background was and what that's like to try and marry the two. Because there was always interesting stories about how they got to where they were and how they reconcile their faith, their medical expertise, their scientific pursuits, all that kind of thing. It was always really interesting to me. I want to ask you also about race, obviously, because I mean, just in the middle of this, you were teaching a course on race. You said there, specifically with Black Lives Matter, and I'll ask it this way about Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter, which is often a response from someone who may or may not support that as strongly as others. Say, why can't I say All Lives Matter? From where you sit, that I'll call it argument, but that may not be the right word, but that those two comparisons of, and I on a previous episode or previous recording of this, I even said I've seen pictures on Facebook of Jesus with Black Lives Matter in it and Jesus with All Lives Matter under it. It feels like you can stamp that wherever you'd like to stamp it. What do you see as those two kind of opposing thought processes?
Mm-hmm. Naturally, I believe my life matters.
Yeah.
We all believe that. I hope. Unfortunately, there's some, I guess, who don't. But there are some people who have not had others say to them, your life matters. And those who have not heard that need to say, Black Lives Matter. And some of us need to say Black Lives Matter because we have not been the kinds of advocates and we have not been the kinds of voices supporting those who are less privileged in this culture
Yeah.
than we have been. Sometimes we think of hypothetical beings as less valuable than some who are living. You know, our superheroes are important to us.
Yeah.
But the persons who live down the street or on the other side of town, we don't think about so much. Even our economic system builds in the idea that there are always going to be poor among you. And the state of the poor themselves, the problems with healthcare and food deserts, the problems with the ways that taxes are levied so that neighborhoods with great money get great schools, neighborhoods with less get poorer schools. We haven't been good neighbors. Those of us with privilege have not been good neighbors to those without.
Yeah.
We have to be saying Black Lives Matter a lot to begin to retrain ourselves to care about the neighbor. Because when we care about the neighbor, we have cared about Jesus. When we minister to our neighbor, we have ministered to Jesus. And we have failed miserably in our tradition with colonization, with slavery, and now with the new Jim Crow, as it's called, you know, the disproportionate imprisonment of African-American males for the same crimes that white males and females are committing. So there is much to be done. And all of this then compounds. I'm writing an article now, Remembering the Earth Charter, which is so sensitive to environmental issues and to human issues at the same time, and to human diversity. And I'm reading in Science magazine about things I need to know. Even though pollution levels are better in the United States than they were 20, 30 years ago, 50 years ago, they are still worse in poor neighborhoods of the poor.
Yeah.
Then you get a hurricane that comes through a place where there are already refineries that are polluting an area, like Hurricane Laura just coming through Lake Charles. Right. What do the refineries have to do to keep things safe? They have to burn off huge amounts of fuel quickly to prevent a disaster. And that only multiplies the pollution in that area many, many, many fold.
Yeah.
And so the same communities, less fortified with healthcare, so that they have poorer health conditions, less fortified by clean air and even perhaps clean water, become more vulnerable. And yet, I'm sure in a dilemma. Do I evacuate? Where do I go? Where can I be safe from both the storm and the virus at the same time? Even going to another family member's home can put the host family or the guest family at risk. So it's all these issues are so profoundly interconnected that it's deeply disturbing that we don't have a lifestyle of care for the neighbor.
Are you going to be teaching courses this fall, this semester?
Right now, an introduction to ministry, and also a course called, what's it called? It's a course on faith-based organizing. So it's about justice issues and becoming active in them.
I want to give any one of your students who is smart enough to watch this series, watch this episode, a chance to really do well in your class here, or one of your classes. What is a question about the times we're living in right now that a student of yours might ask you that might really stump you and really make you go, you know what? I need to think on that a little bit. Mm-hmm. And if he or she is watching right now and taking notes, good on you, man. But what's a question that they can ask you that might really give you some more pause in one of those courses?
Mm-hmm. Nancy, you're really, really, really good at naming the problem. How do we fix it?
Yeah.
That's the stumper. Now, it's not entirely impossible to answer that question, but the problem is that there is no single fix. The problem
Every
is that, yeah, all the way around.
yeah.
Environmental issues, storm response, virus response, no single issue to those isolated problems, yet they are all connected. So what am I going to say? I'm going to say that when our federal government enacts laws that affect the environment and the poor, um, affect different communities of US citizens differently, we have to be sure that those laws are implemented to the benefit of all citizens in the US. We have to realize, I think, that, for example, a great education in a poor neighborhood is a great education for the United States,
Mhm.
because we all become better for it. I want to play, if I'm playing tennis, I want to play with a tennis player who's better than I am, so
Sure.
that I become better. When I play my ukulele, I want to play with better ukulele players so that I become better. The better my neighbor is at what he or she contributes to our society, the better I can be. And so that's a part of my answer to how we fix this. And I started at the federal level. I have to also go to the personal level. What am I personally doing that makes a change in this world? I literally believe if I change, I'm a metaphor abuser here, but I believe that if I am dancing and change the step I do, others have to change the way they dance, or else we all collide and it's a disaster, right?
Right.
I believe that if I change my life by making intentional and thoughtful decisions about my way of shopping for groceries, of buying cars, of choosing when to drive and when not to drive, about recycling and waste, I make a difference. Maybe it's my small one, but if enough of us do it, that's why the March of Dimes work, to use another metaphor, right?
Yeah.
A dime at a time, we can affect a disease. A recycled can at a time, or the choice not to buy the canned beverage, but maybe to drink water, changes things. I believe that we can make a difference by speaking. Say what you believe.
Yeah.
Question what you believe. Enter into dialogue with other people about why they make their choices, about health issues, about environmental issues, about race issues, about ethnicity, about gender and sexual orientation. Why do you make your choices? Where did they originate? Are you operating by default in this world, or are you being thoughtful about why you do things? And have you thought about your relationship to your neighbor? As important, have you thought about your relationship to God? Because my understanding of sin has to do with the idea that I don't just sin against my neighbor, but when I hurt my neighbor, I have hurt God.
Yeah.
I have committed an affront against the very being I hold dear and at the center of my faith. Are you willing to risk that with the choice that you make?
Do you really play the ukulele?
I do.
Well, then you're changing the world a little bit every time you do, I think. I like to think you are. Uh, I say this to all my guests, and I mean it literally. I could sit and talk to you for hours, Dr. Howell, and I don't want to take up your entire day, but I want to ask you one more thing. One day, I hope, I pray, we're going to get out of this, and we're going to get back to some semblance of something, whether that means not having to wear masks or not, or I don't know what it's going to look like, but I hope and pray that it's going to be better eventually. When we get to that point, what do you can answer one of two questions. I'll give you the choice. What do you think we will see from the faith community, churches, congregations that is different before all this happened? Or what do you hope we will see from congregations and churches and faith community members of all faiths that's different than what we were before this started?
Maybe two things I can think of. One is, I hope to see more people marching. protesting. When we see things that are unjust and unfair, I hope to see us on the front lines. Now, I may not be down at the plaza,
Yeah,
but I can be online. I can be in any number of spaces, calling myself and others into better care for the neighbor and for the enemy, for that
sure.
matter. That's what our tradition tells. The other thing I hope to see, and this is the slightly techie side of me, is I hope we begin to use technology more to be more inclusive of people in our conversations about faith and in our participation in worship. This has given us a chance to connect with people we hadn't before. And I
They don't have
especially,
to come in the building. They don't have to come in the building like they used
that's
to.
right, I especially love Zoom because we get to interact. But we've needed ministries like this for a long time to meet the needs of those who we've called shut-ins for a
Yeah,
long time. They can be a part of Sunday school classes and small groups and of worship in an interactive way now when they couldn't before. I can remember conversations and laments about how are we going to do Eucharist? How are we going to do the Lord's Supper? And rights like that when we can't even be in the same space. You get a virus and it teaches you that you can do it
right.
because God is in every space. The Spirit of God, the Holy Spirit, is in every space, and the blessings of God fill the planet. There is no place we cannot worship.
Dr. Howell, I can't thank you enough for your time today, for your honesty, for your wisdom. I'll thank you for the ukulele too, even though I didn't get a chance to hear it. Seriously, thank you so much for your time and your effort today in this conversation. And again, I encourage you to comment. Dr. Howell, is there a way that you, or can someone that saw this and has extra questions for you, can they reach out to you through the school? Is there a way to touch base with you if somebody who hears this would like to ask you something?
Yes, through the St. Paul School of Theology website, which is www. .spst for St. Paul School of Theology.edu. I have a page there and there's contact information. I'm especially available by email because I am not usually by my phone and on
Okay.
campus.
Well, obviously, Dr. Howell knows a whole lot about a whole lot. So if you have questions or things you'd like to send her way, please feel free to do that. And again, reach out to me on social media and let us know what more we can do to further the conversation. Dr. Howell, again, thank you for your time. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. And let me know when we're doing the show on faith and ukuleles.
And absolutely. You're a top of the line first guest whenever we have that episode. Done.
Okay.